Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Street Entrepreneurs Workshop. Today, we have with us Dr. Winokur and Dr. Winokur. Together, they have 20 plus years of experience in the biopharmaceutical industry, and they'll be talking to us about product launches. Dr. Denise Winokur actually has launched more than 10 products for several billion-dollar brands, and Dr. Andrew Winokur was a previous FDA consultant. So if you guys have any questions about that, you can ask them. Thank you guys so much for being here with us today.
You're welcome. Hi, I'm Denise Winokur, and I am a consultant to the healthcare industry, meaning biopharmaceuticals, devices, and entrepreneurial stuff, like I think many of you in the audience are doing. I consult in marketing strategy and business solutions to drive end-to-end product life cycle growth, from concept to commercial development to launch and to maturity. It's a lot to say. Andy?
Hi, I'm Andy Winokur. Just brief overview. I'm a professor of psychiatry at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine. I've been involved in clinical trials examining new experimental drugs for the use of various psychiatric disorders throughout my whole academic career. But my ticket to being involved in this exciting program today is that I have been involved with the FDA over a period of time, initially as a member of the Psychopharmacologic Drug Advisory Committee to the FDA. And then following that, I had an 8-year period of time where I was a special consultant to the FDA, where I was privileged to participate in a number of advisory committee meetings looking at various drugs and devices that were being reviewed for potential approval for different therapeutic applications. And now it's back to Denny.
Okay. Product launches in the biopharmaceutical industry take grit. I chose the word grit because it appeared to me it's the mantra for street entrepreneurs, which I find to be an exciting organization. And it does take grit to launch products. Grit being growth, G for growth. As an example, from a shareholders report, Lilly quotes, I'm quoting Lilly, the corporation, as saying a new period of growth driven by newly launched products and potential medicines emerging from late stage pipeline. In other words, they're telling their shareholders that the growth is coming from the pipeline and the launch of new products. R for revenue. In this same shareholders report, Lilly said, and we expect to deliver 5% revenue growth annually from our new products. Again, to the shareholders, delivering on growth and revenue. I for influence, that is persuading your buyers and users. In the marketing aspect, you want to influence, persuade your potential customers or patients or physicians to adopt and continue to use your product. T for targeting. Who are your customers? Who are the patients? And how do you find them? Starting with the clinical trials, starting on the left, you see it takes about 10 to 17 years to develop a product to launch. That's a long time. And the success rate, if you start with 10,000 molecules, of those, 10 molecules end up in clinical trials. And of those, only one new drug comes forward. So it's a pretty stiff success rate with a lot of effort and time and money put into the development. But when it's successful, it's a strike for patients and for physicians, as well as the corporation. So on the right, we have the cost. That's what $1 billion looks like, spelled out with all the zeros. $1 billion about per drug successfully launched. And of those drugs that are successfully launched, only about 1/3 of them have met pre-launch sales expectations. And in fact, there are often disappointments, not just at the 10,000 molecule stage or 10 molecules going into trials, but in the actual clinical trials phase and well into it. For example, solizumab, a Lilly product, did not meet its phase 3 primary endpoint. So by then, a tremendous amount of time and effort had been invested, failed their primary endpoint, no longer any product, gone. Hypokalemia candidate from AstraZeneca. In 1 year, AstraZeneca ZS Pharma applied twice to the FDA, and they were turned down twice in 1 year because the FDA has a requirement for manufacturing facilities, and they come out and inspect your facility, and twice the facility failed. So now on a more positive note, Andy's going to take us through the drug development journey.
Okay, so my role is to provide a very brief overview and perspective on the role of the FDA in the review and hope for approval of new compounds that are put forward by sponsors for hope for approval and ultimate marketing. All of the stages in this drug development journey that I've listed on this slide come under the auspices of the FDA, and data from all of these stages are submitted to the FDA for their review. But I'm going to particularly focus on the 3 stages in the middle, which comprise the focus of clinical trial studies that must be conducted by sponsors and submitted to the FDA for review, leading to hope for approval and marketing. So phase 1 starts the clinical trial process with a focus on evaluating safety. And I might add that even though companies will have done numerous studies in animal models, partly to get a sense of safety, the only truly relevant and cogent information on the safety and acceptability of a new therapeutic candidate can be obtained once clinical trial studies in human subjects are initiated, which is what happens at the phase 1 level. Phase 1 studies typically entail enrollment of normal healthy volunteers, typically a couple of dozen subjects to perhaps twice that number are enrolled, but the key point is obtaining enough broad information about the safety of the new proposed therapeutic agent in humans to make a decision that it's appropriate to go forward with further clinical trial studies. And as an aside, a careful eye is also kept on any signs of concerning toxicity that might bring an immediate end to studies, because if a drug is not viewed as sufficiently safe and free from toxic effects, it cannot be an appropriate candidate drug. Once having passed the initial safety assessment, studies move forward to phase 2. And in this phase, patients are recruited who have the disorder or disease that the company has identified as being the therapeutic target for use with their candidate drug, or in other words, the indicated disorder. And phase 2 studies represent the first time where information is collected to determine the efficacy of the new candidate drug in treating either clinical symptoms or observable, measurable signs or biochemical parameters of the disease that the drug is being studied for. So phase 2 studies are often referred to as proof of concept studies, and it's really the first time that information becomes available as to whether the candidate drug actually demonstrates promising improvement in the population that it's been proposed to be useful for. Once information has been collected from phase 2 studies, which typically involve 200 to 400 to 600 patients to give a general sense of the scope, then a decision is made by the sponsor to move forward into phase 3 studies, which are referred to as the pivotal trial studies in a drug development program. Typically, several large pivotal trial studies are conducted by the sponsor, each of these studies enrolling several hundred patients with the indicated disorder, so that quite typically in the phase 3 clinical trial segment, 4 to 6 pivotal trials may be conducted, but the general expectation on the part of the FDA is to see at least 2 large independent studies that produce clear and compelling evidence for the efficacy of the candidate drug in treating the index disorder. And in addition, across all stages, phases 1, 2, and 3, safety data are continually collected and carefully assessed. So with that, let me go to the next slide. Can you advance? I wanted to mention 2 important legislative acts that have had important roles in determining the responsibility of the FDA in the drug review and approval process. The first being the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, and this was signed into law by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. While this new legislative act covered a number of different aspects of the role of the FDA, importantly, for the first time, what was put into legislation was that for a new drug to be approved and then marketed, it had to be judged by the FDA to have an adequate and acceptable safety profile. And in addition, the company sponsor had to provide the FDA with enough information about the appropriate use of the new therapeutic agent so that the FDA could provide adequate labeling information about the use of the new drug for prescribing physicians. Next. So to give a little background to what I have on this slide, in 1999, over 20 years ago, I had the privilege of attending a week-long training session at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA that was provided to FDA new reviewers, and I was participating as a new member of the FDA Advisory Committee. Much of the time during this week training session was devoted to the topic of safety and also in FDA terminology, risk detection, assessment, and management. And on this slide, I've written down from my notes from this meeting questions that were discussed in great detail during this training session, which I just wanted to review for you. First, what does it mean to be considered a safe drug? How far does the FDA need to go, and how far is it expected to go to manage risk? And what standards do patients and physicians demand with respect to the review and approval of a new therapeutic agent? So mind you, this was a meeting over 20 years ago, but if we think about our current situation with the pandemic and discussion and anticipation of the development and ultimately review and hope for approval of vaccines for coronavirus by the FDA, we can all appreciate how incredibly important these issues of risk detection, assessment, and management continue to be right up to the present time, and the awesome responsibility that the FDA has in getting this right. Next. So the second important legislative act that I wanted to mention is the Kefauver-Harris Amendment that was signed into legislation in 1962 by President John F. Kennedy, who's shown in this picture with his head turned. And right in the center of the picture is Senator Estes Kefauver from Illinois, who had a key role in driving this legislative act forward. So in the legend beneath the picture, it mentions that much of the impetus for passing this additional legislation came from the horrendous circumstances of the development of the drug thalidomide in Europe, with the development of terrible neonatal abnormalities in children born of women who had been exposed to thalidomide. So, not surprisingly, part of this act reinforced the important role of the FDA in safeguarding safety on behalf of the general public. But another important aspect that has become crucially important in the role of the FDA was also introduced with this amendment, which was that for the first time, it was legislatively mandated that a new drug had to be shown to be effective for the indication, the condition it was proposed to treat, prior to the FDA approving the drug and leading to its being marketed. Next. So my final slide is just giving a sense of, at least my perspective on what the FDA is looking for as they evaluate the efficacy part of the efficacy and safety perspective that they're legislatively responsible to evaluate with any new drug review and approval. So point number one, data must be obtained from what's described here as adequate and well-controlled studies. And pragmatically these days, this translates to studies that involve randomization of subjects and almost always involve double-blind and placebo-controlled circumstances to have assurance about the reliability of the efficacy data obtained. Secondly, a standard that is consistently maintained these days is that the studies must be conducted by clinical investigators who are qualified to conduct such studies based on their previous experience in clinical trial studies and also by their clinical experience and expertise in evaluating the condition that the drug is being evaluated for. Third, the results obtained must support the conclusion that the candidate drug is effective for the indicated disorder using the most rigorous and cutting-edge data analytic techniques available. And if I were to summarize my understanding of FDA standards with respect to the efficacy criteria, it's my interpretation that the FDA is looking for unambiguous proof of the efficacy of the candidate new drug for the indicated disorder. And with that, I will turn the presentation back to Denny.
Thank you, Andy, for that great discussion on the role of the FDA in launching new pharmaceuticals. Now, turning to launching a new biopharmaceutical from the point of view of marketing, there are 4 elements that I'm going to discuss in the upcoming section: market understanding, competitive intelligence, marketing strategy, and execution. And I'm going to, at the end, integrate these elements into several applications. Epidemiology. There are two key metrics in epidemiology. One is prevalence, that is the number of people living with a diagnosis at a particular point in time in a particular place. Note, a particular point in time. Incidence is the number of people newly diagnosed within a given period of time. Incidence is a rate. Now, applying this chart is a chart of incidence and prevalence of diabetes over many years. And what you can see here is that the incidence has started to dramatically decline since 2008. On the other hand, prevalence appears to have stabilized since 2009. So what does this mean? And as you think about launching a new diabetic product, is this a good opportunity for you? What can be said is that the interpretation might be the continuous increase in diabetes may be due in part to novel drugs being launched in the market, to people with the disease living longer and having access to better and more healthcare services. So incidence and prevalence, thinking about those metrics as you think about developing a product for diabetes and then launching it. Moving to disease presentation, there are three parts: symptoms, diagnosis, and treatment. I think we all know what symptoms are. However, it's not as clear-cut as I have a cold, I have a runny nose. There are a number of additional considerations that go into a physician's understanding of symptoms. Taking celiac disease has a range of typical and atypical symptoms. So what does that mean for the diagnosis? In celiac disease, diagnostic uncertainties resulting from unrelated CD symptoms. And given the complexity of celiac disease, physicians have developed, when they're diagnosing CD, a pragmatic 4 out of 5 rule, meaning that if a patient has at least 4 of 5 criteria, the diagnosis is confirmed. Treatment can be classified in a number of different ways. Classes and products, that means products within classes. A treatment algorithm, which is essentially a guide to follow for a physician when they see a patient. There are prescribed ways to treat that patient over the time that the physician is seeing the patient. Standard of care is the community's acceptance of a particular way to treat a particular diagnosis. And finally, guidelines. Guidelines are usually developed by either a government agency or a professional organization, and they tell the physicians treating that disease or diagnosis how to follow through step by step, patient type by patient type, how to treat the patients. And as a bit of an aside that I think of interest to those of you in the audience thinking about opportunities in healthcare and product development, the treatment area may well be a good area for the use of artificial intelligence techniques. That's just my idea. Here we have 2 examples of the types of treatment processes. On the left, we have squamous cell lung cancer. And this is an example of the standard of care, what is accepted in the community as the right or best kind of care to deliver to a patient. And what you see is there is a first and second line of treatment that's prescribed. First line, there are several different choices. And then second line, there are several different choices of products, but this is what would be prescribed for treating this type of patient. Opdivo is circled because I'm going to come back to that toward the end. On the right, for acute and chronic heart failure, this is an algorithm from when the patient first comes in with symptoms to see the physician and steps through all the different pathways a patient could go from diagnosis to treatment. Actionizing. Actionizing is my word, but I chose it to talk about how we can put into action these concepts we've been talking about. This is a diabetic patient flow that I'm going to talk about. In diabetes, there are poor diagnostic rates. Access to optimal treatment is an issue, and achieving glycemic control is poor. So, where is the best opportunity to focus launch efforts? Do you start and focus on the 34 plus million patients with diabetes? Or perhaps consider focusing only on those who have been diagnosed? And again, half of those have access, and that means half do not have access to care. Or among those with access, do you focus on those that are treated, which is 4.3 million from the original total of 34 million? But of those 4+ million patients that are treated, only 2 million plus reach the diabetic goal. So thinking about where you would focus, I would suggest you focus on the 4.3 million patients who have been treated, and within that group, focus on the 2.1 million patients who are untreated. Why? Because thinking from a commercial point of view, there are many patients. Can you hit each of them? Do you have the budget to hit each of them? And will your product be successful in every patient? Or do you want to go to those who are actually diagnosed and you know their targets for your product? Or among those who are diagnosed, do you want to focus only on those who have access? If you focus on all the diagnosed, that leaves you with the financial burden of activating all of the diagnosed patients and sorting through them and coming to, having spent all that money, finding only the 8 million who have access. And among those with access, only 4.3 million are treated. I suggest this is the group of interest to target for your new product, because they've already passed through several gates and they're up to a large population for marketing efforts, but smaller population to focus your efforts and use your budget wisely to bring those 2.1 million untreated patients to the diabetic goal. Celiac disease happens to be one that has a high unmet medical needs. Looking at unmet medical needs gives you the opportunity to see places that you might want to develop your product or that you might want to include as part of a clinical trial, because that is an opportunity for your new product at launch. So what are some of the kind of unmet medical needs? Recognition. 83% of the celiac patients are undiagnosed. Well, if you could activate some of those, and there are a lot of them, that gives you a target opportunity to use your product. And why are they undiagnosed? Celiac disease happens to be not on the radar screen, so to speak, for physicians, especially PCPs. In terms of the diagnosis, as we talked about in market understanding, there's a diagnostic delay. That is prolonged delay in diagnosis of about 4 to 11 years. Imagine if you were that patient suffering from 4 to 11 years before you were accurately diagnosed. And then often there's a misdiagnosis. In terms of treatment, there is no approved pharmaceutical product currently for celiac disease. The only current treatment is gluten-free products. So clearly there's a need for novel agents to reduce the inflammatory consequences of celiac disease. Finally, in terms of product development and preparing it for launch, there is no clear regulatory pathway, no consensus on clinical trial designs, including the endpoints. And finally, better or good non-invasive surrogate markers are needed. Looking at the stakeholders, that is to say, who are your customers, your potential users for your new product? There are multiple stakeholders in the healthcare system. First, I start with the first and I would say most important of the patients. Then there are a range of providers, physicians, specialists, NPPAs, pharmacists, physical therapists. Depending on the specialty, there can be specific stakeholders, such as dietitians for obesity or phlebotomists for sickle cell disease. Then there can be some disease-specific healthcare delivery system opportunities. And in the case of hemophilia, there are hemophilia treatment centers, which are highly specialized centers of integrated care for the hemophiliac patient. Other stakeholders, key opinion leaders, they have a direct and indirect role in influencing the adoption and use of a new product. Non-traditional stakeholders include patient advocacy groups, traditional media, and now social media. And finally, a key stakeholder are the payers. Turning to the element of competitive landscapes. Competitive analysis shows the strengths of the competition, revealing potential opportunities which can be useful in developing the launch strategies and promotional materials for the product you're interested in launching. Each discrete opportunity has its own competitive set and competitive dimensions. Let's look at a couple of examples. This is a bar chart, and the immediate item that you notice is the clear leadership by Baxalta. So if you were evaluating hemophilia and wanting to know what the competitive profile is, the strongest player, the leadership player, is Baxalta. As you can see, there's the market share in the two subsets, or one subset and the whole of hemophilia. You can instantly see the key competitors, and you can learn the value of the market. And of interest, you can see, for example, hemophilia A has 2/3 of the value in hemophilia. Here's a different way to look at a competitive landscape. This is for AML, acute myeloid leukemia. In one slide, one overview, you can see a snapshot of potential product success, pipeline competitors, and clinical trial status. So there are your competitors. There's your pipeline. There's the assessment of what is furthest along in development in terms of gene mutations, and the strongest 3 candidates at the time for AML new products. The clinical trials are outlined here. You see how many, what stage they're in, issues around the clinical trials designs, the promising novel therapies, and within each one, potential promising products. Now, turning to the strategy part of a biopharmaceutical product launch, positioning, which some consider the key element, most consider at least one of the key elements. If I said to you, chocolate bar, what would you say back? If I said to you, a repairman who doesn't get much work, what would you say back? If I said to you, a ketchup that's thick and slow running, and in case you didn't say anything back, it's a Hershey bar, the Maytag repairman, and Heinz. Positioning brings together market understanding, which we've been talking about, and the competitive landscape that we just finished talking about, to develop product differentiation in the mind of target customers. Positioning tells customers what the product does for them and why it's special, so that they make the purchase and keep making the purchase, the revenue in grit. Briefly, positioning is a unique competitive offering in the mind of the consumer as communicated by the marketing team and by the corporation. So very specifically, Volvo is a global automotive brand with a clear reason for being, and that's safety. Avis celebrates their number 2 ranking, showing you don't always have to be first. You can craft your positioning in a way beneficial to your product. So Avis is number 2 because it means to consumers we try harder. Okay, a word about market shaping and strategy, and that is, in the pharmaceutical industry, products must adhere to unique regulatory requirements, as Andy talked about in the section on the FDA's role. In terms of positioning, questions to consider for a successful positioning statement. Is it achievable? Is it differentiating? Does it provide a sustainable leadership position? So, for example, if we think about potential inputs for celiac drug positioning, first we start with the clinical trials, and in this case, I'm assuming marketing and medical alignment on the clinical plan so that the clinical trial results support positioning. Differentiating elements to meet the unmet needs we went over in celiac disease could include first-in-class non-adjunctive therapy, once-daily novel therapy, improving the quality of life by not having the patient have to follow a gluten-free diet, and For whom is this product ideal? Patients diagnosed with RCD2. Segmentation in terms of strategy and market shaping, positioning, then I consider segmentation, which is based on the idea of understanding the potential customers or patients or physicians or other professionals have different needs and attitudes. So segmentation sorts them into subgroups that are heterogeneous between segments and homogeneous within segments. And this is an example of 5 different segments of physicians for a certain disease. Segmentation optimizes the efficiency of marketing and promotional expenditures by identifying those with the highest potential and receptivity, providing a tighter target for marketing and promotion, and identifying early adopters. And again, in terms of key considerations for implementing a successful segmentation, how actionable are the segments, how big, how accessible, what is the potential for each to grow. Finally, in the strategy section of, in terms of market shaping, another deeper step is physician portraits or any other customer portraits, in particular patients, where you have your segments and you have key metrics of interest for prescribing, the value, in other words, the value of each segment. And this is what's key to the portraits, understanding the behaviors and the insights that drive each segment, so that in the promotional materials you can direct the behaviors that are appropriate for each segment to that segment. Now, designing the product for success. So far, we've talked about differentiating the product, the clinical trial plan, positioning, segmentation, customer portraits. Now we want to target our efforts. I'm mentioning here micro-marketing, which is a term for putting all this information together and being able to essentially talk to each segment you're interested in. Also, in the pharmaceutical industry, or biopharmaceutical industry, as many other industries, but in particular, the sales force has target lists that they call on. And because of the understanding in the pharmaceutical industry of how physicians treat, how they practice, where they are, a company can put together their target segments and match those to the target lists, thus giving each rep a very profitable opportunity for each sales call. Finally, promotion, execution. There are multiple channels that can be exploited for use of in your promotional materials. And I mention and point out online and digital are relatively new channels that are being much used currently. And then among each channel, there are many types of activities that can be developed and used within each channel. I mention here in particular, again, websites, both branded and unbranded, and social media, which are becoming popular activities in the channel of online and digital. So the promotion mix uses strategy based on understanding the market, the product, and the customers to make decisions on which channels and which activities for which which channels and which activities for each channel leverage the promotional dollar. Okay, time for applications. I'm going to go through 3 applications. One is DESTROKE, which is a stroke product. One is Tresiba, which is a diabetic product. And one is Opdivo, as I mentioned in the beginning, for squamous cell lung cancer. I choose DESTROKE for this audience because it is a novel app that's being developed and commercialized by a physician, a neurologist, who has been through a program much like the Street Entrepreneurs program. And he is at this point trying to gain customers and investors. And these are the materials he's developed. The situation is patients do not make it in time to the hospital to get optimal treatment. Knowing this, as a physician, he's developed a mobile stroke detection app based on the NIH stroke scale, which is a validated scale. And here we see the application of what we've been talking about to how he's used it in his materials. What we see, we start with the marketplace. In the marketplace, stroke is the #1 cause of disability. The incidence, 800,000 strokes annually. Target patients, those patients who have had a previous stroke. Why? Because 1 out of 4 patients have had a previous stroke. So similar to the diabetic example I gave you, you can find these easily. They're already in the system with a high probability of having another stroke. The positioning clearly is 2 hours. In other words, getting the diagnosis within 2 hours gives the patient 2 years of quality of life. Now, Tresiba, a diabetic product, from the Tresiba label, attributes. And this is the data from clinical trials. And this is the profile of Tresiba. And this would be what is essentially given either to the marketing team or the advertising agency to develop the promotional materials. In this case, I'm going to talk about convenience that the agency used in developing a TV commercial. This is a commercial they named Ready. And what you see is Betty the waitress decides that she's Tresiba ready. And because it's a once daily, and we saw that that's the convenience attribute, to control the high blood sugar that she experiences as a diabetic. And who is this product for? Adults with diabetes. And in here you see even more commentary about convenience. And finally, a commercial. This is for Opdivo, as I mentioned earlier, the most prescribed immunotherapy. And what the agency has done here is it has taken positioning as Opdivo, an immunotherapy treatment, could give them a chance to live longer. And what you see in these 2 slides from the advertising are an efficacy message, competitive message, living longer versus chemotherapy, the target patients, and from your physician portraits and patient portraits, the emotion of hope. So in summary, the key points are the importance of market dynamics, knowing and or exploiting the competition, developing your strategy through market shaping, and developing your execution through promotion channels and activities. So I think what you can conclude and take away is that launching a new biopharmaceutical product is
It takes grit.
Thank you. God, I was blocking. Thank you. I'll finish that. Excuse me. This is live. I'm sorry. Takes grit, but no grit, no glory. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for that beautiful presentation. I know you put a lot of time into it. So just for those watching, I want to give you a little bit of background as to how we got to this workshop. So at Street Entrepreneurs, we believe that the people experiencing the problems ought to be the ones solving the problems. And we accept people who have grit and who see a world that doesn't exist and are willing to bring it to life. And we specifically care about those that have firsthand experience. And one of the entrepreneurs that was accepted into the program is launching skincare to treat his own skin. And he really inspired this workshop because in order to get his product in the hands of other people who suffer from similar skin conditions, he has to go through an entire FDA approval process, testing process, sales process. And I wanted to find someone who had done this before. And then he has launched tens of products for multi-billion-dollar companies and has been in the field for a very long time. So I asked her to put together this presentation. It obviously isn't applicable to everyone in our accelerator, but it's applicable to those that are trying to launch biopharmaceutical products. And even if you're not, there's still a lot you can get from it. But the sales process and the marketing process for biopharmaceutical products is very specific. So I wanted to provide this very specific workshop. So right off the bat, one of the questions we've got, and just so you guys know, you can ask questions in the Facebook Street Entrepreneurs Messenger, and we'll be happy to ask them, right? So, but one of the questions that already came up is, so what are the ethical implications of marketing to physicians and speaking to patient emotions, right? When you're launching new drugs, there's often side effects that sometimes are not even discovered until years after the product is launched. And it could, produce some really dire consequences. So could this create a conflict of interest if you're marketing directly to physicians?
Do you want to talk about ethics?
Okay, I can start and then Denny may want to add. So this came up in both directly and was a bit inferred. In the legislative acts that I made reference to and some additional ones, the FDA is not only responsible for determining the efficacy of a new drug for a given disease or indication, but it also monitors very closely the marketing practices of companies, certainly including advertising. So companies are not allowed to put into advertisement any claims that do not have evidence supporting the efficacy for what is described in the advertising claims. Companies have been penalized and sometimes to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars for advertising or for promoting products where the claims have not been supported by the evidence obtained. So in terms of at the individual patient level, they certainly have a right to expect and need to expect that the information that they're being presented with by their provider is credible and is based on sound data and evidence. And I think patients have a right and obligation to be inquisitive consumers. And if a physician is recommending a product, for the patient to ask for more information about what the evidence is to support the prescriber's reason for recommending it. Companies have certainly been overly enthusiastic in their promotional aspects, but I think based on some experiences with very severe penalties and fines for completely overemphasizing claims that were not connected to data, I believe that companies are much more circumspect about how their promotion relates to the data that they have available to support the use of their product. And Denny might be able to comment on that from her experience.
Yeah. I'm thinking of GRIT, the I in GRIT, which is influence. And I believe this question is directed at the ethics of influencing physicians or patients or other providers. And I think Andy really outlined the constraints on the system. The FDA is extremely careful about what you're allowed to say. I think it's a fair question, and I think we all know the answer, but I think it's a fair question to ask. How ethical is it to know so much about an individual, that you've learned through marketing analysis, different kinds of studies on positioning and segmentation and portraits, knowing all that information and being able to type an individual and speak to them what you know they want to hear? I think it's a fair question. Is that ethical or not? I think from certainly the consumer goods industry, they are not nearly as regulated as, take for example, Listerine, not nearly as regulated an over-the-counter product as prescription products. The answer, whether you agree or disagree or to what degree, is that companies are allowed to do these kinds of studies. The FDA is making it somewhat harder to be able to obtain data from physicians. And for example, there are new laws for marketing research that if a physician participates in any marketing research study, they are required to put that on, to report any and all income that they get from marketing research or pharmaceutical endeavors to the IRS. So it may be making life a little bit harder to be able to gather data and then to implement it. But that is a part of the world of biopharmaceuticals today.
And I'd like to add one more aspect to this. It's a really important issue. I want to present a slightly different side of this discussion. There have been recent studies showing that in many cases, and I would say it's as frequently as about half of the time, important advances based on cutting edge clinical research are not incorporated into routine clinical practice because physicians at the front line are not necessarily adopting some of the advances that have been studied and shown to make a real difference. So we have this balance between jumping too quickly to accept some treatments based on promotion that's not well substantiated on one side, but on the other side, clinicians in some cases not being too slow to adopt practices that have been demonstrated through rigorous clinical research to make a real difference in the improvement of patients with a given disorder. So it's a delicate balancing act. And again, it does put pressure on patients to understand where they optimally are in terms of their situation with treatment. But I really think being an informed consumer from the patient point of view is critically important. And as a physician prescriber, I love having patients who have tons of questions to ask me about what I'm recommending to them.
That's awesome. So let's say you are an entrepreneur. Hypothetically, let's say you're building an AI algorithm to help individuals on the autism spectrum display their emotions in a neurotypical manner. And in order to make this FDA approved, you have to go through clinical trials. So you're not a doctor. You're simply a person who developed this, right? Where do you start? What's the first step?
As I was listening to the question, I'm reflecting back to the presentation when I talked about DESTROKE and using the NIH stroke scale, and I made a big point that it's a validated scale. Yeah. I would start with finding a validated scale that's accepted in the professional communities and use that to be able to evaluate the patient and to use that in the materials that you present to the FDA. That the benefit is that you have something that's validated, and you can use that as a tool in your clinical trials, and it can then facilitate the trials and the approval.
And I might add, what the situation you're talking about is really not that unusual from my experience over the years, and more frequently in recent years. I've had interactions with people who are not physicians, often much more technologically based, but have really neat ideas about approaches, often applications that might be very relevant to the evaluation and treatment of patients. And they come and talk to clinicians or clinician investigators to kind of share ideas and get some feedback about how, from the in the trenches perspective, this kind of idea might come to life. And so it can lead to very useful collaborations. It's something we're seeing increasing examples of the striking promise, certainly in my field, in psychiatry and behavioral science. I think ideas like this are increasingly being recognized as a potential value, but I think Denny's example of the neurologist, stroke is just a horrendous public health problem, and anything that can help identify patients who need to be evaluated more rapidly would have a huge public health benefit.
Yeah, I can even picture a tiny robot maybe that can just monitor individuals that are at risk of stroke, right? Or yeah, monitor individuals for falling. But here, so let me try and break that down a little bit. So if you are building a technological solution to help individuals in a broad spectrum of areas, and you're going into clinical trials, you would recommend to partner with a university to do that clinical trial? Or do you think people can do it themselves? Is there by any stretch of the imagination where someone could design the clinical trial themselves?
You can design it yourself. I'm going to let Andy answer part of this. You can design it yourself, but making it universally accepted and believable and by the FDA, I think would be more challenging. I think also, and again, these are just my thoughts, that partnering with an established group, whether it's a pharmaceutical company or a hospital, gives more credibility to your new device or AI product. But
So,
then, Andy, when you go to the FDA, how would do you think the FDA would respond to an individually authored dossier of clinical trials? Because it's a dossier, it's not just one trial.
Right. Well, if you're talking about at the FDA level, that dialogue has to start very early on. You can't do the studies and then bring what you have to the FDA. You have to get involved with the FDA at the earliest point of thinking about what you want to do. And they are receptive to working with small companies as well as huge corporations in looking at what the indication is. And again, they approve devices as well as pharmaceuticals. So my area is more in pharmaceuticals. I've had a little device experience.
awesome.
But I'm going back to what I said earlier. I've had, and also colleagues, a moderate number of experiences where people more from the technology area have come to talk to me or a colleague because something that they've come up with from a device application perspective in their mind has potential utility for a patient situation. Again, the example with stroke is a great example, but I could talk about many examples in the psychiatry, and also I do some work in the sleep field. I mean, everybody these days has the equivalent of a watch that gives them feedback about their sleep and what. So, I mean, I think it's widely used these days to kind of understand how technology might inform our health patterns. But there are people who think that there can be therapeutically useful applications of such types of apps. And I think that involves an appropriate dialogue between the people who are technically knowledgeable and sophisticated with the people who have the clinical experience and perspective, and maybe also a subset of people who know about conducting clinical trials, to develop a game plan in terms of how would this play out. And it often takes kicking ideas back and forth because I have a pretty good idea based on my clinical experience and my research experience about, let's say, depression and what kinds of problems patients with depression have. But what the new app might be able to detect that would be unique to us as clinicians, and how that might provide new information, and in what way that new information might inform diagnosis or treatment or outcomes. I think that would really involve a collaborative exercise to figure out what might we get from this type of collaborative approach. And then at some point, and it's a business decision and judgment call, when there seems to be enough potential and momentum with this, definitely seeking out an initial very preliminary meeting with an FDA officer to talk about where this could go from a development and review perspective, and what the FDA would be looking for. In some cases, with very new novel approaches, and Denny had this in one of her slides, there aren't predetermined guidelines from the FDA as this is the kind of information we need to see in order to feel that what you've produced is approvable. So with very new and innovative efforts, it sometimes requires discussion and interaction with the FDA in terms of what the investigators are thinking about and what the FDA feels would satisfy. And again, I put it in terms of unambiguous proof of efficacy, because that's really what their responsibility tells them they need to identify. And sometimes with a very new novel treatment intervention, one of the challenges is what type of data can be obtained that the FDA can feel comfortable in making that regulatory decision.
Right. And we have another question from the group, and it says, does a company require FDA approval for supplements?
I think it depends on the supplement, right? I'm going to
Go ahead.
I think it depends on the supplement. Excuse me. I've been working with an entrepreneurial group that has as their novel product a diet and nutritional support for cancer patients. And they are going through clinical trials for approval for that particular product. And given the severity of patients with cancer needing nutritional products, I think it's appropriate for them to seek approval, to do clinical trials, and to seek FDA approval. I think there are many nutritionals that are not approved, and they may have had to go through some kind of not FDA process, but some other consumer process to be approved, but they're over the counter. So I think it depends on the supplement.
Here's an anonymous question for you guys as well that may be considered a natural supplement. I'm building a product that uses various herbs and CBD to address pain, anxiety, and depression. I wanted to name these issues in the marketing, but would it open me up to lawsuits from the FDA? I plan on saying these statements aren't cleared by the FDA for some protection. Would it be better to go around any medical language, especially for marketing purposes? People don't like admitting anxiety, depression, and chronic pain anyways. Thank you for your insights.
The question is a biopharmaceutical product that needs approval?
So this individual has created products that use herbs, natural herbs, and CBD to address pain, anxiety, and depression.
Correct.
Now, she wants to mention these as possible solutions in her marketing statements. So this tea, for instance, will help with your anxiety and your depression, but she's afraid that naming these as potential cure, like as a potential, not cure, but treatment for anxiety and depression, could open her up for lawsuits because it's not FDA approved. So she hasn't gone through an FDA approval process. And even if she wanted to, I don't know if CBD is considered a controlled substance or not. Anyways, she's asking for some advice. how should she go around the medical language? Can she? How might she go about this?
Okay, so
Or anonymous.
may not be the right people to ask about this because this sounds more like something that would require a legal interpretation. So here's the most that I can offer. There is a requirement in doing research with new experimental drugs or drugs that have been approved for one use but are now being tested for something else, that in initially starting such studies, and I've been in this position, you have to apply to the FDA for what's called an IND, an investigational new drug license. And everything that you do in starting such studies will be under the auspices of the IND, and the FDA closely supervises that. You have to file annual reports. But with some substances, the FDA does not require an IND, and that would potentially apply to natural substances that are viewed by the FDA as being, that they have a term called generally regarded as safe. So if it fell under that category, it's my experience that the FDA would not feel that studies needed to be conducted under an IND and under their auspices. And that could potentially apply, but again, I don't know enough about the product that this individual is talking about. So if the FDA has made a determination that an IND is not required, then would that also mean that they don't feel that they have a legal responsibility to oversee the marketing of that compound? Again, that's something where I would feel getting somebody who has the legal background needs to chime in about that. But at least in my role, being in a university where everything that we do is carefully overseen, I would not do and would never do any study involving human subjects without checking with the NDA as to whether the substance that I was using in my testing required an IND. But again, there is a definite potential that they would say, no, this doesn't need an IND because it's in the category that they have classified as generally regarded as safe. But at least in my role, I can't be the one to make that determination. I need to have submitted to the FDA, get that feedback, keep it in my files to show the FDA gave me feedback that this line of research did not require their oversight and did not require an IND.
Okay. Here's one that kind of expands on that a little bit. So I'm developing a homeopathic cough drop that uses dried fruits from the Amazon. The fruits are regarded as natural products in Latin America. How do I know if it's safe in the US? So I think you were referring to deemed as generally safe or generally regarded as safe. How might a person look up a compound or a fruit in the FDA database to determine whether it is generally regarded as safe?
I believe that's readily accessible through the FDA website. I think one can enter the term generally regarded as safe, but this shorthand expression that uses GRAS, G-R-A-S.
Got it.
I think you can get their listing of compounds that they have evaluated and have put under that category. I believe that's quite readily. I mean, there's a ton of information available through the FDA website, fda.gov, and including the generally regarded as safe compounds.
So basically, if you're creating a cream or a tea or a natural supplement that uses compounds that are generally regarded as safe by the FDA, you do not need FDA approval to commercialize a product. Or please correct me.
I would, that would make sense to me. Again, in my role, I have to get some confirmation from the FDA that they agree with that, and then there may be, legal interpretations that I'm not privy to, but I think it's fair to say that the FDA does recognize a number of natural compounds in there generally regarded as safe that would not require an IND in order to conduct studies. That part I feel I know enough about to.
Now, where it would get tricky is if you're making a claim about whether this natural substance produces an effect or not, because then you would need a clinical trial to point to, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so what you could do is you could say chamomile is naturally regarded as calming. There isn't an FDA. I mean, it's generally regarded as safe by the FDA. But there isn't a clinical trial that talks about chamomile treating anxiety. So could you use language to get around that? Like chamomile has been known to produce calming feelings. Can you just put a disclaimer and say it might do this, it might not clinical trial, but you know what I'm saying? A little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a lot of claims out there that when you look at what the evidence to support them, it's pretty unconvincing, at least for someone that's used to the FDA standard. But again, whether that's legally permissible when it's not under FDA auspices, I can't really comment on. Another avenue, now that we're thinking about it, this is a little out of my usual area to think about, but for people for whom this is relevant, it might be another resource to look into. There's a division within the National Institute of Mental Health that looks at the use of the therapeutic use of natural products and tries to promote that. And so by virtue of that being the case, there are going to be people in that division who have experience with a lot of these kinds of issues. I haven't had a lot of experience with that division, but a number of years ago, some other colleagues and I had plans to do some very rigorous research on the use of melatonin to help with problems with insomnia, which I think most people in the audience would be familiar with. And melatonin is not a prescribed drug. It's not regulated that way. And that project did fall under the auspices of that division at NIMH, and they were supportive of further studies to really delineate scientifically to what extent melatonin could be useful to help with problems with insomnia. So what I'm saying is, apart from the FDA, another place of maybe information and guidance could be that special division at NIMH. And I'm sorry I can't recall the exact name of that division, but I can easily get it and pass it along through you if that would be helpful to anybody.
Yes. So I know I kept you guys way too long.
It's not a problem.
I have one more question, and two questions. Okay, these are mine, and I actually just selfishly want to ask them. So in your time working in the pharmaceutical industry, what is the one thing that you wish you could change? Right? So just as a not a street entrepreneur, but as a private citizen, one of the things that really frustrates me is that so much public dollars go into NIH research, and they find these brilliant solutions, and then the pharmaceutical industry takes them and commercializes them, and it feels like those public dollars just go towards making the pharmaceutical industry more money. Is that just a perhaps kind of brainwashed or dark view, um, or would you say that could potentially be a critique or room for improvement for that money to be reinvested back into research in public institutions? I don't know.
I have.
Go ahead.
I think you have a couple of questions in that one big question.
Yes.
I think the beginning of it was what I wanted to address is in my years in the biopharmaceutical industry, what would I like to see changed most? Access. I think access for patients to care is the biggest issue. I think it's more important, bigger than cost, because, and the other parts of your question deal somewhat with cost and revenues of a pharmaceutical company. But I think I would like to see access changed, because that will drive ability to really help patients, deliver quality of care, and address costs. Those are the three sort of aspects of healthcare that people, the iron triangle of healthcare, that you can't get all three. And I would choose access over cost and quality. And that, by the way, there's a book written by William Kissick on this. To answer the part about NIH publicly funded trials, I think there's been a lot of negativity toward using taxpayers' dollars just to study diseases, and diseases that may not even affect that many people. Again, the prevalence kind of issue. And I'm just drawing this conclusion. There's been a severe reduction in the clinical trials that can be sponsored by NIH or other departments in the government. And I think that's a tremendous loss for patients, because pharmaceutical companies tend to start with and sponsor products. Remember the pyramid going 10,000 down to 10 down to 1. They tend to want to sponsor trials where there's a lot of opportunity. I think the government-sponsored ones tend to be trying to solve real problems, often for orphan diseases or small populations, something really novel and risky. And I think, though that tax dollar is a valuable one for patients and humanity, then I myself don't know how to answer your question about the relationship between NIH-funded clinical trials that actually yield a product or yield the data and the input for product development, and then what happens to it. Does it go, what happens to it and who gets the money and how is it shared? That I don't know. Do you have any sense?
I guess just to clarify, what I mean is, and I don't know if this is Pulp Fiction or if there's something behind this, but I've heard a lot in recent years about how this like public dollar funded research and solutions in the biopharmaceutical industry are then taken and commercialized by pharmaceuticals who profit from the public investment. And that money doesn't get put back into the development of new solutions for public good, right? And in the patenting of drugs, sometimes, so like you develop the solution, but then who patents it and then sells it is the pharmaceutical company who doesn't invest back, right? Does that make sense? I don't know if that's true or not. I haven't done my research, but I wanted to hear your take on that, you guys' take.
It's a really complicated topic, and probably there's a need to devote another hour plus to this.
Yeah.
I think I understand, I hear you, and I understand fully that perspective. On the other hand, Denny presented a very powerful slide that talked about the number of pharmaceutical drug candidates that start in the process and how few that make it to successful marketing. And the cost to the pharmaceutical industry in the process of keeping that research and development going. I don't think as a country that we don't want to keep aspiring to develop new drugs that provide more effective and also safe treatments. And I can talk to my field, and my field is only a small section of the total public health spectrum. From the time that I entered the field of psychiatry, at which time the field was dominated by psychoanalysis, not to be disrespectful of that, but where we had very few other treatment approaches, and just were at the earliest point of having meaningful and effective medications to help patients with various psychiatric disorders. And when you talk about depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety, schizophrenia, and substance use disorder, you're talking about a huge segment of medical problems for the public sector. The advances that have occurred in being able to manage these conditions over the past 30 to 40 years have been striking. Not that we don't have a lot further to go. And in my view, that advance has really depended on a collaboration of clinicians advancing the field clinically, clinical investigators doing rigorous research, often sponsored by NIH or NIMH, and then the collaboration from pharmaceutical companies working collaboratively with us, because they develop the drugs, but they don't have the patients and have access to the patients. So without that collaboration, the research doesn't get done and new products don't get generated. And I think that's been to the clear benefit of patients, certainly at least in the field of mental health. So I think it's a delicate balance, and clearly there have been concerning instances of excessive profits on the part of pharmaceutical companies, but also a lot of economic stress given the challenges that Denny pointed out. So I don't think we've figured out the perfect way to do this, but to me, integrating the resources that we have across clinical, basic science, and pharmaceutical.
Kept you guys over so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'll let you finish your I'll let you go.
We're okay. Did you have another question?
No. That was. I mean, I can ask you questions forever, but we'll make that a tea session between us. But
Wonderful.
thank you so much for taking the time. This was wonderful. And if you are starting a product to soothe your skin or to soothe yourself, and you know it works for yourself, naturally you want it to work for others. And now you have the steps on how to do it from a pro, from pros with PhDs. And thank you guys so much for being here. I learned so much. And I'll be sharing the presentation to those who signed up on the Eventbrite. And I'll talk to you guys soon. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank
A
you.
pleasure, Juliana.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.